I actually don't disagree with what you said. I don't think the world requires Venezuelan oil right now. There is ample supply with the OPEC unwind that started last year. We are looking at potentially one of the biggest oversupplies in 2026, over 2 million barrels per day. Now, having said that, lots of factors are going against it already, especially with a lot of Russian oil that's unsold. Kazakhstan's oil is still offline, at least half of it. So there are factors that would suggest that we're not going to get as big an oversupply as a lot of people are fearing. It's still going to be a surplus. But having said that, Venezuela's oil, yes, it's very difficult to process, but it is heavy crude oil, which refineries like, particularly in the U.S. Gulf Coast.
But it needs feedstocks, lighter types of oil to in order to process it, because as you say, it's very heavy oil and needs to be turned around, and it takes a very complex processing. So who would provide those feedstocks? Is that the point here? Well,
part of it would come from the US. Right now, it's Iran and Russia that provide the feedstock. So it's far more complicated, I would say. But one thing we haven't talked about, you said that the industry, the upstream industry in Venezuela has been completely destroyed. We've done some analysis. Some of the experts we have in our upstream team are actually from Venezuela themselves. Just to raise production by 500,000 barrels per day would be about $10 billion and would take 2 years. Anything which, going back to what they used to be the peak, 2.5 million barrels per day, closer to $100 billion, anywhere between 7 to 10 years.
Trump is talking about the billions that oil companies, the US oil companies, could spend in Venezuela. What would be the backdrop for those American companies, international oil companies, wanting to invest again in Venezuela? What exactly would it take?
I think that's the critical thing. Right now, traders are reacting to there could be a lot of oil. Firstly, to Steve's point, we don't need it right now. But longer term, yes, we will require more oil as, potentially there is a supply crunch coming. But that's kind of the long-term story. The issue is the infrastructure is so dilapidated. Like gas processing, without gas processing, you can't even think about increasing oil production. There is no gas processing capacity left. We haven't even talked about the billions of dollars of debt that Venezuela owes, including, guess who, to China, still over $10 billion. And most of this Venezuelan oil actually does go to China. So is a company just going to go in there, assuming that, firstly, the new contracts will be actually agreed to by any new Venezuelan government in the future? And then where on the pecking order are they in terms of the debt payments?
It's incredibly complex, isn't it?
Yes.
And what happened previously in Venezuela in terms of the nationalization of oil interests, conflicts over existing contracts layered on top of today's world, and whether a transition government can lead to some sort of peaceful and potentially, would you say, democratic backdrop eventually? Would that be necessary to have democracy play out? Because that's not exactly what Trump is talking about as he's suggesting installing the vice president potentially, who is part of really the existing regime.
And for me, that's the most interesting thing, that what has changed so far? Yes, we have taken Maduro out of the equation, but the exact Chavismo is still in power. Sure, some of the kind of comments coming out that they might be working better with the US to come up with some sort of solution, but fundamentally nothing's changed on the political landscape. Also, the blockade remains in place. Venezuelan exports have already more than halved just in the last few weeks.
Amrita, for markets this morning, it feels like the debate is really around the potential short-term disruption versus the long-term impact of a potential boost in oil output from Venezuela. When you put those two, driving forces together, what does it mean for the oil price?
I do think the back end of the curve probably feels more pressure, because everyone we're talking to, all the traders over the weekend, really asking us about what's that 2 to 5 year outlook. I do think there is no 2 to 5 year outlook. I mean, 2 years, sure, they can get 500,000 barrels per day. That's not the game changer. It's really much more longer term. But again, to you guys' point, there needs to be stability first. There needs to be clarity first, in terms of so many things with regards to the political backdrop, but also the debt and the infrastructure. Who's going to pay for this infrastructure build-out, by the way?
In terms of paying for the infrastructure build-out, what's your take?
I cannot see, and even US companies, if you've seen of course, they'll be interested in going back, but nobody's really jumping on this simply because it is a really big undertaking. Every single layer of it, right? Because you have to rebuild from scratch. Also, let alone the fact that so many personnel have left. They have a massive brain drain as well.
Just on, I have a view that this is typical Trump. And look, there's a million aspects. This is my editorial opinion. It's typical Trump. The world is now looking at Trump and Venezuela and his foreign policy and what it means for Cuba, what it means for Colombia, what it means for Mexico, etc., etc. Yeah. And you mentioned China and Iran and Russia as well. It's got so many angles, and we wouldn't get through them all in a 10-hour show. But I can't help thinking Trump is getting everyone to look over here when actually what he wants to do is get people to, it's not look over here. And what he doesn't want people to look at is the domestic situation in the United States, the domestic inflation picture, the economic picture, and the fact that actually he is behind in the polls, or potentially for the midterms coming forward as well. I can't see at all how this plays out well with his base. There's already been some MAGA advocates who have said this is not an America First policy. This is an adventurous policy, which we do not want to see America in as well. I don't see how this affects the American economy, and that's what I think is the key point. Everyone's looking at the US foreign policy. I think we should be looking at the US economy for why Trump is doing this as well. Can you see any reason, and you look at things from a macro point of view, how this will change the backdrop to the US economy?
No, I do not actually see any near-term impact.
Not going to change the price of gasoline, which is now $2.83.
To what, $1? Because suddenly there'll be like 20,000.
Which will be a disaster for Exxon, Chevron, and Conoco. Yeah,
of course. But also, like, how much new oil? If the blockade's still in place and sanctions are still in place, there is no new Venezuelan oil coming to the market, right? Short term, I think there's more downside than upside risk. And like we just discussed, it's going to take years and hundreds of billions of dollars to actually get this to turn around. That's probably why, though, he's spinning this as we're going to get the oil back, right? So that he can claim that, okay, look, we're going to get oil prices down.
The point you make is a fascinating one about the optics here and whether this is a gigantic distraction technique. But you could also say the same around foreign policy, because Trump was getting mired in a lot of different issues globally. Is this a distraction technique around foreign policy specifically because it's designed to put other world leaders on edge, where he's been struggling to solve the war in Ukraine? If there was any movement here, and are there ramifications when it comes to that situation? What about when it comes to Iran as well? Yeah. Could you have a situation that moves forward from here? Very tactical operation in Venezuela could be different if there was a further move by the Americans when it comes to Iran, trying to solve what's been a very difficult country to interact with for the Americans. How do you think about the broader consequences of what's transpired in Venezuela impacting other oil-heavy nations?
I think what he is doing in Venezuela is definitely going to be heard and seen very clearly in Iran, in Russia as well, right? In terms of whether you think or say that, look, you need to take him seriously, or that don't dismiss it when he says, oh, I am going to be doing X, right? I think that's definitely something world leaders will be very careful about. But to your point, especially around Russia, Ukraine, that has gone nowhere, right? And if anything, the sanctions, I know there's a lot of oversupply right now. We don't talk about it. We are hearing from different sources about 80 to 85 million barrels of Russian oil unsold, floating around.
How many?
80 to 85 million barrels.
Wow.
Yes, and this is not being reported in the media because, again, it's hard to kind of capture exactly how much since really November. So there are these things that are brewing, and if, by the way, if suddenly you take that oil out of the market's not as oversupplied in 2026, right? And then gasoline prices are not going to be $1, it might even be $3.50.
Amrita, well, just to take that part of the conversation a little bit further, over the weekend, OPEC Plus decided to keep output steady. No weighing in on the political developments. Obviously, it's a fast-moving target here, but over the coming weeks, how do you expect OPEC Plus to weigh in and potentially respond?
I don't think they ever really get involved in the politics, right? We've had different OPEC nations even at war with each other in the past, and OPEC as a institution has survived all of that. And I think policy has been, and it was a less than 10-minute meeting again, policy has been keep production steady for Q1. Don't see that changing. They want to see what happens through Q1. It's the weakest period for oil demand anyways. And then they'll reassess, again, Feb, March, they have meetings. And again, they take the long view, right? They know this Venezuela situation is super fluid every day. Between Rubio and Trump, you hear different things within hours, right? So nobody really knows what's going on either.